You know that not everyone communicates in the same way, but do you know how to communicate better with people to flex your style to meet theirs? You're going to learn about that today. Welcome to episode 125 of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to talk about leadership, teamwork, organizational culture, and human potential with experts from every walk of life. Your host is Kevin Eikenberry, a best-selling author and leadership thought leader for 25 years. This episode is sponsored by Kevin's book, The Long Distance Leader: Rules for Remarkable Remote Leadership. Order your copy today at remarkablepodcast.com/book. And now, here's your host, Kevin.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We're here again. And today I have someone you're going to be happy that you get to know, someone I've known for a very long time. And let me introduce you to Guy Harris. Guy draws on more than 20 years of combined professional and military experience when he consults, coaches, and trains in the areas of teams and interaction dynamics, communication strategies and tactics, and emotional intelligence. He has both a bachelor's and master's degree in chemical engineering. He was a qualified engineering department head in the U.S. Navy. He is a master trainer and coach in the DISC model of human behavior and a workplace conflict resolution expert. He writes the Recovering Engineer blog. He's sometimes known as the Recovering Engineer. We might find out about that. And he co-authored a book with me, From Bud to Boss: Secrets to a Successful Transition to Remarkable Leadership. He is a husband, father, and grandfather, and now he lives in Travelers Rest, South Carolina. Guy Harris, welcome finally to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.
It has taken a while, but it's good to be here, Kevin.
Yeah, well, I suppose I could have had you on first or sometime early, but we finally got the chance to do this. And so I guess what I didn't say is that Guy and I worked together for a number of years, not just in but lots of other stuff. In fact, when we finish recording this conversation, we're going to just catch up on some other business stuff that we need to talk about. But doesn't change the fact that Guy is the perfect person to have on this show, and I'm glad to have you. So, Guy, first, military, engineering, doing what you do now. Tell us a little bit about the journey that got you to here.
Well, the thing that led me into the world of leadership development, communication skills, conflict resolution, started basically out of college when I found myself in the U.S. Navy, immediately in a leadership role, and very quickly realized that all of the technical training I had did not prepare me at all to do what I had to do with my job. The reactor actually was an easy problem to solve. The pumps were easy problems to solve. The control systems were easy problems to solve. And I had these humans that I had to work with. And as a result, I struggled a little bit because actually my formal education did not prepare me for that. And even the little bit of leadership development in the Navy, officer candidate school, fairly minimal. Got through that. Okay, it's a highly technical environment. You can kind of get by. Then I entered industry, went in the chemical industry, again, a technical world, and in the chemical industry. And again, I was confronted with humans. And I realized, at about that point, I started realizing, man, I better figure out this human thing or I'm going to be in trouble. And with only a year of individual contributor experience and all that time, I was in leadership roles of one kind or another for about 20 years. And I just realized I've got to figure out how to work with people. I've got to figure out how to understand people better. And I started on a journey of attending not webinars at the time, but live in-person courses and listening to these things called cassette tapes and reading books and trying to get mentorship from people who are more experienced than me and those kind of things. And it just gradually turned into an area where I was having success. And people started asking me questions. Hey, what are you doing that I'm not doing? And I would say things like, well, I read this book, you ought to read it. And they would say, no, I don't want to read the book. Why don't you tell me what you're doing? And then it just kind of morphed from there. Several situations developed, wound up teaching some classes, and eventually decided that I would try to pursue it more on a professional basis.
And I don't know how many years ago it was now. You probably know because there's a difference between you and I about how we remember details. And we started working together, and I have to tell you, for those
Been a while.
if you were to rewind,
Yeah.
of course, no one would say rewind now, but if you had a cassette,
Yeah, that's right.
you would rewind. And for some of you who don't know what a cassette tape is, you can Google that. It's it had sound on it. But anyway, so that's, in that journey, somewhere in that journey, DISC became a part of that DIS model. And, I mentioned your experience with that in the intro, and we wrote about it, use it in the book From Bud to Boss and in our work around From Bud to Boss. So I'm guessing that most people who are listening or watching us have some clue about DISC, may have heard of it, may have taken it, etc. But what I want to do is have you sort of, I guess I have two questions. One is, what is it?
Yep.
And what isn't it?
Yeah, that's big.
Maybe the second is as important as the first.
It probably is, yeah.
What is it, and then what isn't it?
Well, the DISC model is one of the foundational pieces that really, I guess you'd say, flipped the switch for me in my journey of trying to understand people. Because it's a structure for how to understand people, it resonated very strongly with my engineer brain. Now, I started with this is stupid psychobabble mumbo jumbo when I first learned about it. Then I started realizing, wait a second, it works, and it actually helps me understand people and helps me be less stressed. When I started seeing that the model itself describes 4 quadrants of human behavior, it makes it very simple to understand another person's perspective. So it becomes a framework for understanding my perspective and how it might be different from another person. So I can figure out how to bridge those differences between us. So what it is a behavioral model that lets me observe a person's behaviors and start to at least get a clue or a view into their world, at least a little bit, so that I can start to understand.
You're using an awful lot of weasel words there, guys.
I am, because of what it's not.
Well, so here's the observation that I would make is that when you use the word clue, so the word clue to me implies that maybe I have a better guess. Had before, right? So you talk about being on a submarine and knowing what the pumps are going to do.
Yep.
You could get pretty close.
Yeah.
On some physical things that were happening or whatever. You had some really strong clues. But here with human beings, far more complex,
way more dynamic,
to deal with. You're talking about a model to give us clues, right? So
clues.
That's what it is. So what isn't it?
So what it's not is a way to label, stereotype, or judge other people. It's not a way to decide if somebody's capable of doing a job or not. It's not a way to decide if somebody's got good work ethic or doesn't have good work ethic, or is honest or not honest, or has emotional intelligence or not. It's just a way to get a perspective, get some kind of guess or clue about how another person might be seeing the world, so you can bridge a difference between you and them. So what it's not is something that's prescriptive and locked in and perfect definition. It's not that clean.
So it's very interesting to me as I listen to you. I mean, I guess it doesn't surprise me because you and I have talked about it, but everyone else that's listening been in our conversation. Is that what you've been describing is, I'm guessing, very little of what most people have experienced if they've done DISC. Now, they've all been taught, if they've been taught that it's not a way to label and all that stuff.
Right, probably have.
You gave a description that was very much about other people, how I can use this model, or how we can use this model to other people. But in my experience, most of the time when people have this assessment done or have the opportunity to do this assessment, it's very much an inward thing.
Tends to be.
So talk about that dynamic of the value of it or the intent of it inward versus outward.
Well, the piece that's valuable in an inward perspective is it can help you understand your own view of the world. And then in reference to this, how it's different from another person. So it can be the starting point or the launching point to build better emotional intelligence. So you can be more aware of your triggers and what it is that other people say or do that's natural to them that isn't natural to you. And because it's not natural to you, it might get under your skin or irritate you or cause confusion or those kind of things. So it can help you build self-awareness. And it is a good tool for that. It's a really good starting place to build self-awareness, which then becomes the stepping stone towards, well, how do I take this understanding of myself and get better at working with other people? And I think that's one of the things you just pointed to that often stops at that, hey, here's who you are level. And one of the things that we focus on is taking this, how do we use this as a tool to become a better leader, to become a better communicator, to become better at resolving conflict, not just how do I know me better?
Okay, so let's go there. How can most everyone listening is either a leader, and
Yep.
those who are aspiring leaders. So how can we use DISC, or there are many other
Many others, yeah.
are very similar, and they're very versions of DISC. But so how can we use these tools? It doesn't have to only be DISC. How can we use these tools to be a more effective leader?
Well, so if you study the tools a bit, say the DISC model, for example, you can start to pick up, I guess you call it shorthand for understanding another person's motivators. So for example, I use myself as an example. Engineer in the terminology.
You than using me. So thank you very much for that. Because I know that when you teach this, you use me all the time. So
well, I use us. I use our interaction.
At least for the moment that you're gonna keep me.
I'll make it all about me. So I've got the C trait as a primary trait for me, and so logical, linear, analytical, monotone probably shows up just in the way I talk. Guy Harris at his most excited is not as loud and enthusiastic as Kevin on just like a normal day. So if someone doesn't understand me and they try to persuade me based on energy and enthusiasm, I don't care.
Trust me, it doesn't work.
I just don't care. It just lands flat. Now, the thing is, now that I understand that about myself, I can start to hear things differently. But if you go back a few years, if you're, as a leader, if you're dealing with someone who doesn't know the model very well or isn't aware of themselves and they don't work on hearing it differently, then you've got to figure out how to change your delivery. So if you come to somebody like me and try to sell them with enthusiasm, they're just going to stare at you like a dead fish. And if you give them data and reasons and logic and linear processes towards what you're trying to achieve, they'll go, oh, I get that. And it just gives you a better way to adjust your message so the other person can hear you more effectively. And as a leader, that's a pretty critical thing, trying to motivate or coach someone on new behaviors or help two people resolve a conflict on your team that might be personality driven. Any of these kind of things, trying to understand the different perspectives can help you navigate it more successfully.
So if you've got a team of folks,
yep,
you got people, they're all different, clearly, but they're also likely have different primary styles, to use the DISC logic or DISC nomenclature.
Yep.
So here's my question. How do you work with teams in relationship to using these kinds of tools? I guess I've got several questions. I thought we'd talk about teams, but we'll start there. Like, how do you use tools like this to help a team grow or be more successful?
The first step is, one, to help everybody on the team understand the model, so they have a framework of using it as a basis of communication. And I'd suggest you have everybody on the team take an assessment so that you're relying on an objective instrument to assess their style rather than subjective judgments between people, because our own personal filters can get in the way if we try to, oh, I know Mary and John and Bill and what I know about them, I know their styles, and maybe not. Let the assessment do that work for you so that you have a more objective view. And so once everybody understands their style and the model itself, then you can start creating some dialogue in the team to help them figure out, how do we work more successfully together? What does our particular combination of traits look like? What are our potential friction points as team members based on both our personal styles and maybe even our job responsibilities? I'd even go one step further and say, what does the overall team look like? And from what we call a team chart or team report, and what is the style of the team overall? What is the percentage breakdown in each area? So how do we as a group come to decisions, and how does that either help us or hurt us in our projects or tasks and our interactions with other teams? So individually and collectively, how do we work together?
It's interesting that you said that, because as you were talking, I was thinking about that very point, that idea of how do we collectively as a team, how are we seen by, and how do we communicate, interact with other teams?
Yep.
So, if you're listening to us, you've been in an organization, likely you've been in an organization that you would say has some silos, right? Where you've got
could be
accounting here, and you got manufacturing here, you got sales over here, whatever. And I am becoming more and more convinced that thinking about the nature of the team compared to the nature of that other team, while it's a higher level of complexity, it's similar to the interaction between two people who have a different style mix, and that I think can be both illuminating and can perhaps be the way forward when teams are struggling interconnectedly. So can you thoughts about that?
Well, I think teams can develop their own style. And so like you mentioned, like I'll just experiences I had in the chemical industry. Engineering, technical, production tended to be in the DISC language, DC in style or flavor, collectively. Not every individual. Collectively, though, they would behave as a group in a very task-oriented focus. Whereas the people in our marketing or maybe our customer service departments would tend more towards the people relational side. And if I look back at some of the conflicts between the teams, some of it was structural just because of different job responsibilities.
Right.
And some of it was just like completely missing each other in terms of understanding the other person's driver. Interaction between, say, R&D and the marketing group, and thinking the marketing guys are flakes. And the marketing guys thinking that we're sticks in the mud. Like, neither of them is really true. We just communicate in different ways when we have our focus in different areas. And once we can figure out how to get past those differences, then we can get the team dynamic also to be more clear and more effective, I think.
So you mentioned this team report, but in general, how do you, as a consultant, as a facilitator, how do you help a team think about those issues? And we'll go back to thinking about this internally to the team.
Yep.
Some of the kinds of things that you do, or some of the kinds of questions that leaders might want to bring to the team to help them think about that.
Well, so what I'd want to do is look at what is a general breakdown of the team, like what percentage of your team has particular traits and which way do you tend to lean as a group. And getting back to the idea that the model is a clue, not a prescription, I would start with questions. Like, okay, so here are some potential challenges or blind spots that might be attached to a group of people who collectively lean towards the task-oriented nature. They might tend to ignore relationship issues when making decisions. So I'd be asking questions around that. Do you find yourself running into challenges with other groups when these kind of situations come up? Or when these kind of projects develop, what are some of your sticking points? I want to then listen to their answers and see if I see consistent patterns. Oh, yeah, that pattern falls into you're approaching it from a purely task perspective and ignoring the people side of the equation. And using the model as a potential indicator, there are some places we might have trouble. Let's investigate that a little bit. I would even, and in talking to the leader, I'd want to have conversations about what do you see as some of the challenges of the team? Where do they run into trouble? What kind of decisions do they have trouble reaching? When they're interacting with other groups, do you see any particular struggles they have or strengths they have that, what goes well, what doesn't go well, and then use the DISC model as a way to filter some of that information to see if there's a clue there about the source of the struggle.
Gotcha.
Or victory, for that matter.
Well, yeah, thank you. It could be either one for sure, right?
Yeah, it could be either one.
So and there's a pretty good point right there. A lot of times we all want to focus on where there's a problem, where we can use a tool like this to help us understand why we're having success and then help us replicate that, right?
Replicate it, yeah. What are we doing well? Let's do more of it.
That's an excellent point. So about teams in general,
Mhm.
Guy, what are I guess I'll ask two questions. I think it's sort of the same question, just two different frames, two different ways. What are the biggest challenges that you see teams having today, and maybe coming at it a slightly different way? What are the biggest questions you get from leaders about their teams these days?
Probably the number one question I get is a question about generational differences. That's the number one question I get, which has nothing to do with the DISC model. Yet I use the DISC model as a way to answer the question and get to the idea that what we probably have is a difference in perspective. Let's see if we can figure out a way to manage that. Let's be careful not to assume that because there's a disconnect in a communication standpoint, there's something wrong with the other person. There's a operating, like the mindset of benign intent, that there's something here I don't understand, as opposed to there's something wrong with that person kind of approach to diagnosing the problem. So I see just fundamental differences in how people communicate. And so they get crossways with each other. They start to assign negative intent to the other person's behavior rather than understanding it. And then as a result, that turns into conflicts. And so if you look at the Tuckma model, forming, storming, norming, you just get stuck in perpetual storming and never actually have the conversation that moves them out of that into the area where they can really get some work done.
That's very true. So I'm reminded of another thing you're talking about, looking at different generations,
Yep.
Perspective. But one of the things that I see happening, and I too get asked the question about generations, and it depends on who's in the room about who
Yep.
I get asked about.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. But in both cases,
Yep.
what they're doing often, what people are doing often, is the same thing you warned them not to do about DISC, which is
Yes.
people say, "Oh, they're a D, so they're 4."
Yes, exactly.
What's happening here is, "Oh, they're millennial, so they're 4."
Therefore,
Or they're Gen X, so they're 4, whatever.
Yep.
I think even though it's it's a different thing,
it's a different thing.
that labeling problem
Yes,
is the problem.
it's pretty strong.
You can't get past that piece.
Mm-hmm. So you get stuck in labels rather than trying to really bridge the difference with the person. Okay, let me figure out how I can connect with this person and understand how we communicate differently and navigate whatever difficulty we have.
You used a phrase a few minutes ago, which if I'd have been wiser, I would have made sure that I had that on my list of things to ask you about. But I didn't. But you brought it up.
Okay.
So it's I think one of the most powerful things that we talk about, and I don't know anyone who's better at it than you in doing it. Is this idea of assume benign intent.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk about that a little bit more, about what it really means? And I'm just getting ready to tell everybody, if you're listening, what we're about to talk about is worth the whole time you're going to be with us. So get your pen out, or mentally or otherwise. But what do you mean when you say benign intent? And then secondly, how do we assume it in others?
Well, what I mean by it is that when another person does or says something that makes no sense to me, or is maybe even irritating to me, to work on setting aside the gap in knowledge I have and filling it in with all kinds of negative, like, oh, they did this because they're a jerk. They did this because they're insensitive. They did whatever negative label that I want to attach to them. They did it because some bad thing about them. Try to set that aside and realize, you know what? I don't really know why they did it. I just know they did it, and I know what my interpretation was. So I'm going to assume that they didn't mean anything bad by it until we can have a conversation and figure out one with the other. And I have learned that most of the time they didn't mean something bad by it. It was just something that was going on in my head that caused me to believe it was bad. Now, how you do it is...
before you go to the second part,
yep.
Why not just tell people to assume positive intent then?
Because it's still an assumption, and we never really know. So what we know for a fact is it had a negative impact on me. I just don't know what you meant by it. So it's,
Or if you meant to have that impact on
or
me.
if you meant to have, I know it did have that impact on me. So the way I think about it is to remain curious rather than judgmental. So, I wonder why they said that, as opposed to they said that because.
And so positive intent is judgmental. You might argue if you had to pick positive versus
I guess that's true.
positive, I would, but it's a judgment. But
It's still a judgment.
by benign is, I don't know.
I don't know.
And
Just
so
don't know.
I got a better chance of figuring out, of having a better future communication if I don't make an assumption or make a judgment now.
It's basically trying not to make a judgment at all. And I guess the danger of negative is that it causes you to get irritated or frustrated, which then, whether they meant it to be bad or not, it's probably going to become bad.
And if you respond in that way, then
it is. We have our whole conflict cycle and off we go. And if I assume positive, I run the risk of being a bit Pollyanna and ignoring something the person did mean to deliver. And I don't dig into it a little bit. Say, let me make sure I understand exactly what's going on here. Because if there's a negative, I want to deal with that, as opposed to just move on and pretend it didn't happen.
all right. So now we know what it is. How do we do it?
It gets to the idea of curious rather than judgmental. I got to keep reminding myself. I wonder what they meant. I wonder what they meant. I know what I heard. I wonder what they meant. Now I got to be honest. There are a lot of times my first thought is they're an idiot. That's why they did that. Then I have to remind myself, no, guy, you just made a judgment. Stop it. So basically, I have to seize that thought that wants to fill in the gap and make an assumption and say, hey, I really don't know. I really do not know what they meant. What I know is what they said, and what I know is my interpretation. Now let's see if we can clarify it.
All right, so we're going to shift gears, everybody. We're going to go to what I call the fast break portion of the program. And this portion of the program is brought to you by my new book. It's called The Long Distance Leader. And you can learn, if you're a remote leader of a team who has remote members, then you might want to take a look at the Long Distance Leader. You can go to longdistanceleaderbook.com to learn more. So, Guy, I have a couple of ideas for you in the fast break. And it's simply, I'm going to share a word. I just want you to tell me what your initial thoughts are or whatever you share in brief about that idea. Are you ready?
Okay. Sure.
Number one is accountability.
Accountability. It's accepting ownership for your contribution to any situation.
Second is conflict.
It's when there's an apparent disagreement between two people.
And the third one is grandchildren.
Awesome.
I have to tell everybody that the reason, if you were a long-time listener, you know I've never given anyone a softball like grandkids. But the reason that I did is to take us back to DISC.
Yep.
Guy said all along that, I'm very sort of logical and all of those things. But if you're watching and you saw the reaction on Guy's face when I said that word, or you were listening and you heard his voice being different, I share that to make a point. The point is that just because we might have a preference, style type, one communication or behavioral style type, doesn't mean that that's all or only
exactly
are. And that was, I thought, the cleverest way I could come up.
That was good.
That point. So,
and it does get to the point that we all have different levels of things that trigger us and cause us joy or frustration or whatever. And a more holistic view helps you stay connected to a person better.
There you go. Which leads me to my next question, which is, so Guy Harris, what do you do for fun?
Fun.
Okay, Guy, ask everybody this question. It's not just for you. Long pause.
What I do for fun is I spend time with my grandchildren. Family's a big deal to me. I actually like to write computer code. That's fun to me. It's predictable. I enjoy going for a run. I like physical activities, usually solitary physical activities. Working out by myself.
Well, because
I like reading.
that's how you recharge, right?
I like reading. Really like to read. So those are some things I do for fun.
All right. So since you mentioned reading, I'll ask the next question, and that is: so what are you reading now, or what have you read recently that people might find interesting?
Well, long distance leader is on the list.
Okay,
So,
that's not fair. I mean, I like
but it's true.
saying that, but
It's true. A book I read recently that I found pretty interesting was a book called The Slight Edge. I think the author is Jeff Olson, if I remember right. And the premise of the book is that great success doesn't come from monumental effort. It comes from incremental victories every day. That's the big idea of the book. To have daily routines that lead to success, that kind of thing, rather than trying to pull off, put things off and pull it off in some monumental effort.
We're not supposed to cram for the final exam. Is that
Not cram for the final. That's right.
all right? So Guy, I know that we do work together, at least.
Yep.
So, but I'm curious, and others I'm sure are curious. Where can they learn more about you and learn more about the good work that you're doing?
A simple place is the team page, the KevinEikenberry.com website, because I'm on that page. My blog is a recovering engineer blog, recoveringengineer.com. And so that has some my thoughts on various issues and things I've written on. And our site, discpersonalitytesting.com, there's a blog there, which has some things around the DISC model that you can learn some more about the work I'm doing. And budtoboss.com, the website for our book and our workshops, also has other pieces of work I've done in the Bud to Boss blog.
All right. And go back to discpersonalitytesting.com for a second. You'll be able to go, people can go there and learn more.
Absolutely.
Team chart, this team process to use with DISC that we talked just a little bit about as well. So fantastic. So everybody, I've got a question now. So now that Guy's done, the question is for all of you, and that is, now what? What action are you going to take for having been with us for 30 minutes? What insights, ideas did you get that you want to go take action on, whatever that might be? I guess the one thing we didn't mention is that if you go to discpersonalitytesting.com, you can get a free
Absolutely, you can.
assessment. And so maybe your now what is to go take a free assessment because you've never done a DISC assessment, and you can certainly go and do that. But my question to you is, what action are you going to take? Now what? What from this will you do something with? Because if you don't take action, while entertaining it might have been, it won't be of any lasting value to you. And that's, of course, what we both want. So I want to thank you, Guy, for joining me and for being patient for me finally asking you to join me. And I want to thank all of you for being with us again for another episode here. And we're here every single week. So come back again for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Bye, everybody.